Just 5 minutes ago, the heart of the monarchy quaked. The gilded gates of Buckingham Palace drew shut, sealing in a silence that felt almost sacred. The courtyard, once alive with motion, stood eerily still. Couriers darted about with sealed letters, servants whispered in corners, and a fleet of black cars rolled across the gravel with grim purpose. Then came the news no one wanted to hear. King Charles's health had taken a devastating turn. A wave of shock rippled through the nation, but within the palace walls. Panic spread even faster than the headlines. Before we dive deeper into what this means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. To outsiders, Buckingham Palace has always been a fortress of calm. Its daily rhythm, its ceremonies, its unwavering routine, all symbols of royal endurance. But that calm shattered in an instant. Meetings were abruptly cancelled. Ceremonial schedules dissolved into chaos. The grand corridors hummed with tension as senior aides traded anxious looks, and secretive phone calls echoed behind closed doors. Something grave, something unprecedented had happened at the core of the monarchy. Medical teams arrived through hidden entrances, unseen by the public. Emergency vehicles, rarely summoned except in dire situations, pulled into the palace grounds, setting off a ripple of alarm among those who knew what such arrivals meant. The palace staff, usually composed and silent, whispered in disbelief. Some murmured of a sudden collapse. Others feared a stroke. A few dared to ask the question everyone else avoided: had the unthinkable finally happened behind those guarded gates? Only days earlier, the king had been seen smiling warmly before cameras, greeting dignitaries with his signature grace. That image now felt almost unreal against the current dread. How could a monarch who had seemed so steady be facing a battle no one had seen coming? Though the palace moved swiftly to silence speculation, the truth began leaking out, first to journalists, then to social media, and finally to the public, who watched in paralyzed disbelief when a spokesperson finally emerged. Their voice trembled beneath its formality. "His Majesty is receiving immediate medical attention," they said, the words clipped and strained. "His family has been informed." The brief statement carried the weight of something far more serious. The message wasn't reassurance, it was fear disguised as composure. Inside the palace, history seemed to echo through the walls. Urgent meetings, calculated messages, and an atmosphere thick with dread filled every room. The story released to the world was tightly controlled. The reality was much darker. Behind the polished statements lay a secret the royal family had guarded for months. Palace insiders now confirm what few had dared whisper. The king's illness had long been hidden. Shielded by golden curtains and rigid protocol, Charles had been fighting something far more tragic than anyone imagined. His illness raised troubling questions about loyalty, succession, and the very stability of the crown. The warning signs had been there. The royal calendar, once overflowing with engagements, began to thin. Major appearances were quietly postponed. Royal tours were canceled at the last minute. Official explanations, scheduling conflicts, or routine adjustments rang hollow to those inside the palace. Whispers grew louder. What had once seemed like fatigue now looked like something far more serious. Behind closed doors, those closest to the king saw changes they could no longer ignore. Once poised and energetic, Charles began to falter, subtle moments at first, then unmistakable ones. His posture wavered, his focus drifted, and his once boundless energy gave way to weariness. Conversations cut short, meetings ended abruptly, and during private events, his fragility was impossible to miss. For a man who had lived his entire life under relentless scrutiny, Charles's quiet decline shook his inner circle. Palace doctors urged him to slow down, to rest, but he refused. After waiting decades to ascend the throne, the thought of retreat felt like betrayal. "My duty comes first," he told confidants. "I will serve until I no longer can." To the world, he remained a figure of composed strength. But within the palace, that illusion was breaking apart as his condition worsened. Queen Camilla stepped in with unyielding resolve. Her presence grew, constant, shielding him from scrutiny, filtering requests, managing his time. Loyal and vigilant, she worked to preserve stability even as whispers swirled. But her growing control raised uneasy questions. Some accused her of concealing the truth not out of malice, but out of fear that one sign of weakness could send the monarchy spiraling. Behind the scenes, a smaller, more secretive circle began to meet. Their conversations were hushed and heavy. What if the king could no longer rule? What if the transition came sooner than expected? The word succession was whispered like a sin, but its very mention proved how dire the situation had become. The monarchy built on centuries of appearances, rituals, and strength now faced the one truth it had long refused to acknowledge: even kings are mortal. Every private decision, every whispered meeting was made under that shadow. The king's health was failing, and the illusion of control was slipping away. Then came the call that changed everything. When Prince William heard the news, his world froze. To the public, he stayed calm, the image of composure, the future monarch in waiting. But behind the doors of Kensington Palace, he shattered. Pacing through the dim study, he wrestled with the brutal truth. His father's decline meant the crown was coming for him far sooner than he ever wished. This was no triumph. It was a heartbreak bound by duty. The moment the truth reached him, his future, the one he'd trained for his whole life, but never truly desired, came crashing down. And in that moment, the weight of the monarchy pressed upon him like a curse disguised as destiny. It struck him sooner than anyone expected, the moment when the line between the son and the sovereign began to blur. His first reaction wasn't one of royal restraint or polished composure. It was raw human anguish. Away from the cameras and the crafted statements, William's defenses crumbled. He was no longer the heir to the throne. He was a son, afraid of what awaited him. That night he turned to Catherine. Within the quiet walls of their private quarters, the air filled with whispered conversations and trembling voices. The couple, so often the picture of royal composure, found themselves undone by tears. Catherine tried to be his strength, yet her eyes betrayed the same fear that weighed on him. She understood the enormity of what loomed ahead, not just the loss of a father, but the close of one chapter and the reluctant beginning of another. Their grief was deeply personal, yet monumental in its reach. Their children sensed the change, too young to understand its cause, but old enough to feel the tension ripple through their home. George, especially perceptive, noticed the unspoken heaviness. His innocent questions cut deeper than any political dilemma could. For William's duty was no longer an abstract crown. It was invading his family's most sacred space. Soon, advisors began circling, their tone gentle but pressing. They couched their warnings in polite formality. He needed to be ready just in case. The words echoed endlessly in his mind. William knew what they meant. There would be no pause for grief, no time to process. Duty was already calling him forward. Through it all, one memory haunted him: his father's familiar voice. Calm yet weighted, the crown is heavier than it looks. Once a metaphor, now a prophecy, as he stood surrounded by whispers, responsibility, and fear no one else could truly grasp. William felt the ground shift beneath him. His father's illness had evolved from personal heartbreak into a national reckoning. And in that moment of private pain, he understood with chilling clarity. The monarchy would not wait for his mourning to end. But while William wrestled with his grief, another force stirred in the palace shadows. Camilla's every look was scrutinized as the king's health declined. Was she the devoted wife shielding her husband, or a queen in waiting guarding her future? Behind the palace's velvet curtains, she waged her own quiet campaign. She knew time was slipping away, not only for Charles, but for her place in royal history. For decades, Camilla had lived in a paradox, embraced and doubted, accepted and resented. Now, as the king grew frail, that duality sharpened into a fight for relevance. In public, she was the image of tenderness, a caring wife standing by her husband's side. Behind the scenes, however, questions grew. Was her protection rooted in love or in strategy? Those who understood the machinery of monarchy saw the signs. Charles's public appearances dwindled. Speeches were delayed. Access to him was carefully filtered. Camilla, under the guise of compassion, was tightening her control. Some saw genuine concern. Others saw a quiet consolidation of power. Her role morphed into that of a gatekeeper, deciding who could approach the king and what truths were allowed to escape. Within the palace, her assertiveness unsettled many. Senior courtiers exchanged wary glances, whispering that she was crafting her own center of influence. William, already raw from loss, began to clash with her. He championed transparency. She clung to control. To him, truth was a duty. To her, secrecy was survival. Rumors spread that Camilla was quietly stepping into Charles's ceremonial roles, attending briefings, overseeing events, making appearances in his name. To some, she was the woman holding the monarchy together. To others, she was already preparing for life after the king. Her allies urged her to secure her legacy before time rendered her irrelevant in public. Her demeanor shifted. The warmth she once projected was replaced by measured reserve. Her smiles seemed calculated. The nation began to wonder, was she hiding sorrow or strategy? Supporters defended her loyalty. Critics accused her of playing chess while the king faded. Camilla's power struggle was subtle, fought not with grand speeches but through quiet influence. She knew history rarely favored those who spoke loudest, but those who moved the pieces while others mourned. Yet, amid the silence, one royal refused to play by those rules, Princess Anne, never one to hide behind diplomacy. Anne stormed through the palace corridors demanding honesty. To her, deception was a greater threat than any scandal. The monarchy's survival, she believed, relied on transparency. And if no one else would speak, she would. For weeks, she'd watched half-truths and evasions cloud the truth of her brother's condition. This was not just a private matter. It was a matter of national trust. When she realized the secrecy was intentional, her patience shattered. Anne was not merely a ceremonial figure. She was a soldier of the crown, duty-bound, loyal, and unflinchingly honest. Behind closed doors, her confrontations with Camilla were fierce. While others tiptoed around the queen consort, Anne charged forward. She accused Camilla of hoarding information and prioritizing optics over integrity. Camilla countered, insisting that secrecy was essential for stability. The result was a clash of philosophies. Camilla, wielding quiet control, and wielding truth like a weapon, their feud became the palace's worst-kept secret. A simmering battle between two formidable women with opposing visions of monarchy in crisis. One ruled through whispers, the other through conviction. And when Anne finally confided in William, her usual composure cracked. Her voice trembled with urgency, not just for the crown, but for the truth that was slipping away beneath it. The people deserve the truth, she told him, her eyes blazing with conviction. This family has survived for centuries because it faced hardship head-on, not by hiding. She reminded him of their mother's legacy, a legacy built on quiet strength and public trust. William, torn between his loyalty to his stepmother, love for his father, and duty to the nation, felt the weight of her words shake him to the core. As tensions mounted, echoes of Queen Elizabeth's final wishes began to resurface. Trusted aides recalled private conversations in which the late monarch had emphasized that the crown must never lose the confidence of its people. Words once distant now carried a haunting sense of prophecy. Anne saw herself as the guardian of that legacy and refused to let it crumble under secrecy. Her persistent challenge to the palace hierarchy unsettled many. Those accustomed to rigid protocol and deference now faced a princess who refused to play by the rules. Meetings grew strained. Memos circulated in careful, diplomatic language, balancing politeness with evasion. But Anne saw through every attempt to pacify her. She made it clear that if honesty wasn't upheld, she would take drastic action, even resigning from her royal duties. The very idea sent tremors through palace corridors. Her defiance was no mere act of rebellion. It was a battle cry against the silence suffocating the monarchy. Anne's resolve ignited a spark that could not be extinguished, forcing the institution to confront truths long buried. Yet the real storm erupted when Harry returned to the fold. Across the Atlantic, the news shattered him. Within hours, he was on a plane to Britain, for reconciliation, but a confrontation between grief and old wounds. One question lingered: would he be welcomed at his father's side, or kept at a distance in the king's final days? When Harry first heard the news, the world around him seemed to shrink. Despite the distance he had placed between himself and the institution, this was still his father. The gravity of it all pierced through years of conflict, headlines, and resentment. His first reaction wasn't political, it was profoundly human. Shock gave way to sorrow, and sorrow turned to urgency. Within hours, travel plans were arranged, his team acutely aware that every move would be scrutinized. Meghan's absence, however, set off a wildfire of speculation. Was she excluded? Did she choose not to come? Was this about family or optics? The media, already in overdrive over the king's failing health, latched onto every unanswered question, fanning the flames before Harry even landed. The palace remained silent, and the public filled that void with theories. For Harry, the flight was more than a journey home, it was a descent into a world that had both shaped and scarred him. His meeting with William was icy and inevitable. Months of estrangement, bruised pride, and unhealed wounds hung between them. Their words were few, their glances fleeting. No hugs, no reconciliation, just the silent burden of shared grief, forcing them into alignment once more. They were not princes at odds, but sons preparing for their father's final chapter. What Harry didn't realize until his arrival was that Charles had made a personal request to see him. In hushed tones, the king had told his aides he wanted both his sons beside him before the end came. It wasn't about duty or appearances, it was about family. That simple wish pierced the bitterness, drawing Harry back not as an outcast, but as a son returning under the weight of loss. The moment by Charles's bedside was wordless, yet powerful. No cameras, no statements, just a father and son, bound by blood and time, facing the inevitable. Forgiveness wasn't spoken, but something softer and truer passed between them, a fragile recognition that love sometimes endures even through betrayal, beyond that private chamber. The palace was a house divided. Some saw Harry's presence as healing. Others saw it as an intrusion. Advisors whispered about optics. Courtiers debated behind closed doors. But grief does not respect rank or ritual. While the royal family wrestled with emotion and tension, the nation held its collective breath. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered in candlelight vigils. Across Britain, church bells tolled, TV screens blared, breaking news, and for once, a divided nation stood united in dread. Was this the end of an era? The quiet unease within the palace spread across the country. Whispers became headlines. Private fears became public mourning. People who had grown up seeing the king as a pillar of stability now stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold, faces lit by candlelight and uncertainty. Flowers piled high outside the gates, notes of love and grief tucked among them. The atmosphere felt suspended, as though time itself paused to listen for the next chapter in history, beyond Britain. The world watched with bated breath. Leaders sent messages of sympathy, their words careful but heartfelt. Across the Commonwealth, countries with deep ties to the crown followed every update, knowing these events were not just personal, they were historic. This wasn't simply the illness of a monarch. It was the closing of a story that had defined generations. The media frenzy reached new heights. News networks rolled continuous coverage. Analysts parsed every word from palace insiders. Across living rooms, pubs, and hospital wards, the same scenes unfolded. Eyes fixed on screens, voices hushed, hearts heavy. Speculation became its own wildfire, feeding both hope and dread. Online, emotions surged. Hashtags of sorrow trended worldwide. Some clung to faith, sharing images of the king in better days. Others braced for the inevitable. And amid the noise and chaos, one feeling echoed above all others, uncertainty. No one could truly foresee what awaited the monarchy. Yet that very uncertainty seemed to unite millions in a rare and silent solidarity. As the tension in the air deepened, the nation's gaze slowly turned skyward. Voices grew louder, calling for William to step forward as acting monarch. Opinion pieces began to debate whether a regency was imminent. Some urged swift action to preserve continuity, while others insisted the family should be allowed to grieve without the crushing weight of constitutional duty. For the first time, the monarchy's future felt immediate, Not a distant discussion, but a decision hanging by a thread. Each hour that passed without word from the palace only magnified the suspense. Britain, a nation often loud, argumentative, and politically divided, seemed to fall eerily quiet. Streets grew still, conversations carried an anxious tremor, and even those long indifferent to royal matters found themselves drawn into the unfolding uncertainty. It was as if the country had collectively slipped into a solemn vigil, waiting for a sign from behind those storied palace gates. Then, just as the silence reached its breaking point, came the midnight announcement no one expected. At the stroke of 12, the palace's golden crest blazed to life, signaling urgent news. Anchors froze mid-sentence. Phones lit up across the nation. Hearts raced. King Charles's condition had taken a sudden and dramatic turn, forcing decisions that would reshape the monarchy overnight. Such midnight statements were reserved for moments that altered history, and this was no exception. The announcement was terse, clinical, and devastating. The king had been moved to intensive care. Though brief, the words carried the weight of an era teetering on collapse. The carefully built image of royal steadiness was fracturing in real time. Inside the palace, doctors worked through the night with grim resolve. Leaks began to seep through whispers of the unimaginable. Some feared the king might not live to see dawn. William and Harry, having withdrawn earlier to separate residences, were urgently summoned back. The bitterness between them no longer mattered. Old silences dissolved in the shadow of duty and blood. Both arrived under the cover of darkness. Stepping into the same halls they once roamed as boys, now heavy with urgency and grief. Whatever lay unresolved between them would have to wait. The king's life and the monarchy itself hung by a thread. Camilla, who had displayed strength throughout the ordeal, finally broke. The woman who had weathered decades of scrutiny and storms beside Charles was seen weeping for the first time. Sources whispered that she had been present when doctors delivered the gravest prognosis. She had long prepared for the responsibilities of queenship, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The prospect of losing him in the middle of the night, while a restless nation pressed against the gates, through it all, Anne remained unshakable. Her quiet vigilance by her brother's side became the anchor of the palace. Staff described her as the pillar everyone leaned on, asking the hard questions others dared not voice. Her composure wasn't coldness, it was the tempered strength of decades in service. Outside, speculation erupted. Was abdication imminent? Were secret plans for transition already underway? Could the monarchy endure another blow so soon after the Queen's death? Questions multiplied, but answers were nowhere to be found. The palace's silence became its own haunting statement, stretching every minute into an eternity. As the night grew deeper, one truth became clear. This was no longer a medical event. It was constitutional, emotional, and historic. The monarchy stood at its most fragile moment in living memory, and every move within those walls would determine Britain's next chapter. Then came the final shock, the statement that rippled through Britain like thunder. The palace confirmed the unthinkable. King Charles could no longer bear the weight of the crown. As the nation grieved, William stepped forward, trembling. This was his destiny, but it came cloaked in heartbreak. The monarchy would endure, yet it would never be the same. The official statement was short, but it shattered the air. In the early morning hours, the palace revealed that the king's health had reached the point of no return. Doctors made it clear his reign had effectively ended. What had been whispered in corridors, feared in silence, was now undeniable truth. The reign of King Charles ended not with grandeur, but with quiet inevitability. William, caught for days between sonship and kingship, was suddenly thrust into the role before the country could even breathe. Facing senior courtiers and ministers, he accepted his fate with visible emotion. This was no lavish coronation. It was a painful, necessary passing of power. The crown felt to him less like an honor, and more like an inherited wound. The weight of centuries pressed upon him as the world watched a new monarch emerge in real time. Camilla's devastation was palpable. After years spent balancing the delicate roles of wife, consort, and public figure, her world shifted in an instant. The influence she had carefully managed began to fade into the background. Observers noted the stunned look that crossed her face, a silent recognition that everything familiar had vanished in a single, irreversible moment. Harry's presence added another layer of heartbreak. Away from the cameras, he shared a final moment with his father. No speeches, no ceremony, just a son saying goodbye. Whatever resentment had once divided them dissolved under the finality of loss. It was a private farewell between two men whose bond had weathered both tenderness and turmoil. Anne, ever composed, rose as the quiet force of the family. She carried out her brother's final wishes, guarding his legacy while standing firm beside the new king. Her resolve was an act of love, a tribute to both the monarch Charles had been and the brother she had always protected. Across the United Kingdom, grief and disbelief mingled. Crowds gathered in silence as breaking news flashed across screens. Church bells tolled through cities and villages, marking the end of one reign and the reluctant dawn of another. Some wept openly, mourning not just a king but the stability he embodied. Others stood in reverent silence, aware that they were witnessing a turning point in royal history. The crown had passed, but the sorrow and scars of that night would echo through generations to come. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next.